Hi, I'm Scott Pilkington coming to you from Mount Eagle, Tennessee. This is the second edition of the Engravers Library, where we talk about the essential books that you really need to have to be a well-rounded engraver. I'm going to talk about two tonight. The first, probably the first major engraving book in this country, was L.D. Nimschke Firearms Engraver by Larry Wilson, or RL as the initials are. This is quite an expensive book in the original format these days. I think they're upwards of $400 and $600, but there's a repro you can get that's usually in the $100 range. I'm not sure exact origins, but we're going to sit down and look at this page by page and see what's in here. The other book that we're going to talk about is American Engravers by Roger Bleile. This book was published in 1980, and really, for a lot of reasons, it's my favorite engraving book. But we'll get into that as we start flipping through the pages here. So let's get to it. Let me sit down here and let's let you see what's here. Okay, let's open up American Engravers, and when I bought this copy in the early 80s, it was signed here by the author, C. Roger Bleile. This was bought from Brownells back in the day. Published in 1980. I probably bought it about 1983, right after I took my first engraving class out in Colorado. Of course, got to have an introduction. But the wonderful thing about this book was written at a time when there weren't many engravers in this country. And it covers, Roger says, every person that sent him photographs, basically. And so there's a really broad mix of styles, but more than styles, there's a broad mix of quality. There's really super over-the-top engraving, and then there's pretty poor engraving, and then there's a lot of medium bread and butter, this is how you make your money engraving, in a lot of different styles, so the engraver can pick and choose. And of course, back in the 80s, it says you know, color was a premium, so this is mostly a black and white book. So we're going to flip through here, try to hit some highlights, and you'll see on pages, sometimes I've made notes. This was really my Bible in my early engraving career. There was so much that I referenced out of this book. And I still think this book is better than most of the engraving books today for an engraver looking for different styles. Because there's so many different coverages that aren't so much in some of the newer books, but we'll talk about that more in a bit. And I'm going to flip through here as I see somebody, Angelo B. Boy, he looks young there. Born in Italy. I don't know if it says when he moved to the U.S., but he's been here. Well, he was obviously here in 1980. I saw him a few weeks ago out in Las Vegas at the Antique Arms Show. He's still chiseling away, very prolific engraver. Of course, he worked for F.N. Browning in Belgium before he came to the U.S. as he engraved 10,000 arms there. I bet he's probably done 5,000 or 6,000 more in the U.S. alone. Very fast. He knows how to put metal chips on the floor, and does it quite well if you flip through here. And of course, if you look at some of Roger's later books, American Engravers 21st Century or American Engravers 3, then you could see some updated color examples of Angelo's work. And there's a lot of engravers in here that did really excellent work that I don't know what's happened to them over the years. But then there's those who did the work. Carl B. or Boyd Bleile, Roger's brother. He was one of those people whose work really inspired me early on. Just nice, beautiful scrolls, great tiny Bellino scenes. And then Roger's got his own page in here. When I first met Roger and kind of got to be friends with him back in 308, not the caliber, but March of '08. Gosh, it was 10 years ago. We met up at a show in, I think it was Louisville, Kentucky. Yeah, at the museum there. He signed it to me and misspelled my name. I'm going to put a red -1 there, Roger. But anyway, here's some of Roger's work. At the time, he's done a lot of great things since then. Brian Bridges, a lot of interesting work. This Southwest Arts, just really wonderful. Another Belgium engraver. Then there's Winston Churchill. If you're in the engraving world, the name Winston Churchill, you know he's not the great British statesman. This work really inspired me so many ways, and lots of different things. And look there, there's a knife that I engraved. Don't know what that's doing in there, but some kind of Celtic scroll I did at the time. I've been using it for a bookmarker, but Winston's game scenes really come to life, and jewelry work. His blackleaf scrolls, just everything about it at the time was over the top. Here's some middle of the road engraving. Mike Duber, a name that's very famous today. He does some really fantastic work these days. At this point in his career, he's come a long way since then. I mean, it was good, as I say, bread and butter work then, but he's doing over the top stuff now. Bob Evans. Well, I should say I met Bob Evans and Mike Duber the first time I attended the Figa show. The first year they had the Figa show in 1985. I was there, had Ron Smith on one side of me and Mike Duber on the other, but met a lot of folks. Jackie Faber was an engraver out of Las Vegas. Good bread and butter engraving. Jeff Flannery, he's a very prolific engraver. I'd hate to know how many guns he's engraved over the years. Lives up in Kentucky still today. His son Hunter's working with him. You know, some people may not like his style, but he puts metal chips on the floor and dollars in the bank. And, you know, sometimes you got to choose in life what you want to do. So you can't fault the engraving he does. Here's another little color section. Ken Hurst used to engrave for Colt, started his own business, and then Old Dominion Engravers came out of that later on. Giuseppe Forte, of course, Winston Churchill, Alvin White. Was Alvin White? Oh, he's in the back. Another one of those famous names, and Leonard Francolini. Here's some of his early work here. Heinrich Frank, fantastic work. Daniel Goodwin, fantastic work. Howard Grant, good work. Fred Harrington, very prolific engraver. I bet he's engraved 10,000 knives over the years. Neil Hartlip. Neil Hartlip is who I took my first engraving class with in 1982 out in Trinidad, Colorado. His work is Neil's own style. I won't say it's the best, but it's certainly not the worst. And he had a large paying clientele as well. So good on him. Frank Hendricks. Frank Hendricks is one of those names that us old-time engravers talk about with reverence. He learned to engrave in Germany, came to the U.S. with the Air Force down in San Antonio. Did fantastic sculpture work, Bellino work, all sorts of varieties of scroll work. I was very fortunate that I got to spend a week with Frank in 1985 at his shop down in Texas. Strange coincidence, but gunsmith friend of mine there in my hometown, Dunlap, Tennessee, had worked with Frank in the Air Force at the Air Force Custom Shop in San Antonio. And he saw some of the engraving that I was doing and said, you should talk to my friend Frank Hendricks. And I was like, what? And you know Frank Hendricks? And he calls him up, and next thing I know, a few months later, I'm on the road out to San Antonio to really increase my knowledge. That was a fortunate thing. Anyway, good examples of well executed, clean scrolls, but simple. I mean, these are the things that the average gun owner is going to pay you for. This is where you're going to make your money as a beginning engraver, or intermediate engraver, or even an advanced engraver. There's a lot more people that can spend $500 or $600 on a gun, or $200 or $300 doing something simple, than a $5,000 or $10,000 job. But speaking of $5,000 or $10,000 jobs, here's some of those from Heidi Marie Hiptemeyer. Excellent work. Steve Huff, excellent engraver. Ken Hurst, little section here. He went on and was very prolific in his later years, had a number of engravers working for him. Bill Johns, Lance Kelly, Tommy Kay. His hat you may have seen if you've ever been to the Figa show in recent years. He was one of the founders of the guild, and his hat was what everybody threw a $20 bill into as they collected money to start Figa back in 1980 or 81, I guess it was. Ben Lane has done a lot of coat work. Was first president of Figa, I think. Still down in Texas, still engraving. A lot of different unique styles here. Really fun things to cut and look at. Nimschke work. Here's classic Nimschke, which we'll get into more in the next book that we're going to look at. But here's some in progress shots. I mean, there's so many different styles. Bill Maines was another engraver out of Vegas. Actually, I was talking to him one time years ago, and found out he was had been in Pikeville, Tennessee, which is the next town up from the little town I grew up in Dunlap. Rudy Marek, Linton McKenzie, another name everybody's going to know. Lots of his great work here shown. Scroll styles, animals, just super. And this design here really inspired me a lot over the years. I've made variations of that on a number of different things. You create, this is a pattern here where you brought the scroll in to fill the whole area as much as possible. But here, you're creating your own borders, your unique borders within the framework of the blank space you've got to work in, and then you can kind of create scrolls that come in and out of that as you wish. Anyway, that, like I said, that inspired me a lot over the years. More well executed engraving, but maybe a little bit simpler patterns. Here's some beginning engravers. Marcello Padini, he obviously was doing some great work. This lady, I don't know what's ever happened to her, but nice looking, well executed, clean cut scrolls. Paul Paquette, engraver for Smith & Wesson, still at it today. Chat with him on Facebook every so often. There's names in here that I've met through the years or run across, seen their work extra well, and some I've never heard of. Jack Perdome, who wrote the book Gun Engraving Review back in the, probably early 70s. He was a boxer and did nice work for the time. Marty Rubino, very young Marty Rubino. Marty was also one of those guys at that first guild show I attended 33 years ago in 1985. His work has progressed mightily since then, but even the work at the time was very clean. In fact, the first time I met Marty at that 1985 figure show, I showed him a 1911 where I had more or less used that design. The scroll work was a little different inside and the leaf structures or whatnot, but the overall pattern was on the top of this 1911 was based on that. And then of course there's no other pictures of that 1911, so of course I had to make the scroll on the flats and the rest of the gun on the sides of the slide match and look good on its own. So that was my inspiration to start out with the gun. John and Hans Rohner. John Rohner was writing how-to articles in gun magazines in the mid 1950s. He was helped James B. Meek with the art of engraving, and he's most famous for being the R in GRS. And he ran the company GRS out of his home in Boulder, Colorado for the first 11 years before it moved out to Kansas. And I've had the opportunity to get to know John quite well, and truly he's a national treasure. There are so many things he knows, so many things he's done. I've written a couple articles in the Figa magazine about his history, and if you're interested in natural history, you'll run across his names. I mentioned Nimschke a while ago. Here's two classic examples of Nimschke scroll work. George Sherwood wrote some how-to engraving books that you'll run across from time to time. Ben Schossel, very prolific engraver, president of Figa for a while. Great guy, fun to hang around with. Bert Sinclair, here's some more very clean, nicely done scrolls, but simple, quick to cut. Russ Smith, another Smith & Wesson engraver, super work. George Spring, another guy that we see kicking around on Facebook from time to time. And here's notes I've got here. There's even a phone number. I wonder what that's about. What does it say? 2 bucket seats for 68 Nova. Well, I wonder if I'll call him up. I might need those. Anyway, George Spring. I love his style of scroll. The way it's shaded and the way it fills up, evenly balanced. That was another of my inspiration. Bob Swartley, one of the great names. Worked with Winston Churchill and Joe Fugger back up at Griffin and Howe, but went on his own. Did a lot of wine labels for the folks out in Napa Valley in California where he lived. Monk Schwarzenegger. Many of y'all know Monk from the Engravers Cafe. Well, here we go. Here's some of his early work. Very interesting. Nice, well executed scrolls, but definitely in his own style. Roy Vale from New York, another person who did a lot of nice engraving back in the day. More names that I'm not so familiar with. Ray Vermontes, figure in Figa many years. Does a lot of clean, excellent, nice scrolls and designs. Just Terry Wallace, Floyd Warren, great work. John Warren, great work. Sam Welch. Anybody that's been to a Figa show in the last 15-20, Sam Welch and his wife Wilma both were at the first guild show I went to, and I've thought the world of Sam ever since. Alvin White, there's a famous name in the gun world. Well, says he's done about 2,500 guns, and certainly anybody that collected Colts knows that name. A number of things of his here to look at. There's Mel Wood. Did a lot of knives, a lot of guns. He had his very own classic style, and a lot of people liked it, and he was a very prolific engraver. Roger, ever the book person, has a glossary in here with all these, at the time, maybe unfamiliar engraving terms. Today, he's got the Gun Engravers Glossary that's hosted by Steve Lindsay. I think it's engraversglossary.com. And of course, at that time, there was addresses. But this is a great book for so many reasons. You can just find so many different styles of scrolls in here. And as I said, there's a wide variety of skill level. But you can see classic patterns like the Nimschke patterns, or Old English, or Germanic, or the Colt patterns, Blackleaf. Then there's also there's some tongue-in-cheek comments in here that if you read between the lines or read between the quotation marks, you'll see some snarky comments made by the author about some people's works. But this is my favorite book. I think it's the most well-rounded engraving book on the market. Because of the variety of scroll styles that are presented and the variety of quality execution levels of the practitioners that did them. So anyway, that's American Engravers. Okay, that's a good look at American Engravers. Now we're going to start into the Nimschke book. And the Nimschke book is full of smoke prints. And I thought before we actually start looking at the prints, I'll go over the technique used to create these prints, because it's a handy thing for every engraver to know, or any person that wants to make a quick record of their gun, be it a serial number or some patterns or lettering or whatever's on there. This is a handy way, a real cheap way to record it. Nowadays we've got a lot more modern methods, castings and video and photographs that are all in our pocket. But in the old days, this was the way it was done. And so first we're going to get down our handy dandy kerosene lamp. Everybody's got one in their house, I suppose, just waiting for the day that the power goes out. You never know when you're going to need it. Old Boy Scout, be prepared. Taking the glow off, bringing up the wick to light it. And basically, you can do this with a candle as well. Probably want something with beeswax. You want a lot of smoke coming out. I don't know if we can see that. You can adjust the flame, but when you see that real smoky soot coming out, that's what you want. So next we're going to take our gun that we're going to smoke up, and we're going to run it while I'm breathing on the candle, which is not something that you want to do. You just want to kind of hold it right there at the top of the flame where the most smoke or soot is being produced. Make sure you get it all good and even and black, which if you look at that gun now, that's pretty black. So I'm going to turn this down so it's not making quite as much smoke here, back down to where it'd be if you were running the lamp. The wick really needs trim, to be honest. So I've got my smoked up gun, and I've got some white paper here ready to go. And I actually took the liberty of cutting out some clear packing tape strips, so I've got those right here already prepared. And I'm just going to lay those down on a flat part of the gun, an area that I don't have smoke, so I've got a good contact and it's holding itself steady. And then I'm gently going to lay that in there, and just kind of smooth that across to pick up this smoke tracing. And I'm going to peel that back up, and let's see if we can see that on the camera, sort of, but not so well. But let me put it here on the paper. And there we have a beautiful, clean print. And this is some engraving I did on a Walther TPH some years ago. Well, let's put the flame out and let's look at this book and see what there is to see on these pages now that we know how they did it. Okay, here we go. This book was published in 1965. I was 1 year old. The first picture we come to is a picture of L.D. Nimschke's business card. Here's a business card I bet you wish you had. I sure do. And flipping through here, we got the title page. Lots of, well, let's read the foreword here, the preface. This is quite interesting. We just saw the smoke pull demonstration I did, but let's read here. L.D. Nimschke's record book consists mainly of a collection of impressions taken from guns, often incorrectly referred to as gun rubbings. They are more accurately called gunmakers' pulls. I would call them smoke pulls. J.F. Howard, in his invaluable work, The Art of Gunmakers, describes during the second half of the 17th and during the 18th century, it was the practice of gunmakers in France and possibly elsewhere to take an impression on paper of the engraved ornament on the firearms they made. This was done either to prevent repetition of the same design on different guns, or perhaps to provide a corpus of material from which a pattern book might eventually be produced. Gunmakers' pulls, or smoke pulls as I call them, are a most fascinating type of print. They are somewhat accidental because they were made from engraved objects, not intended for printing. The engraving was done on the object as an end in itself. For various reasons, the object was inked and an impression taken from it. Thus a print was made when the first intent was to do something quite different. What is particularly interesting about such prints is that they are one of the survivals of the first step in the process, which was the origin of printmaking. There is a gigantic leap between engraving an object and inking the object and taking an impression from it. The hiatus between the invention of engraving and the beginning of printmaker is not just one of years, but of centuries. Engraving is probably the first way in which man left records. The earliest writing or drawing was most likely engraved, for it is a simple method requiring only two substances, one harder, which cuts a line into the other. The softer substance, such as clay, stone, or wood, were naturally those to be engraved first. Later, harder materials, as metal, were found capable as a tool to do the incising. Using the word engraving in conjunction with the discussion of printmaking in more than its limited use as a term to define a certain type of print, the impression taken from an engraved plate, one must remember the wider application of the word. Engraving, by its most simple definition, is the incising of a line with a graver into a metal plate. In the history of printmaking, it is not the incised line which first holds the ink that prints the impression, but rather the surface of the design, which stands out in relief. It is much simpler to take impressions from areas in relief, for they can be inked and stamped without the application of pressure, whereas to print from an incised line requires an ink which will stay in the lines when the surplus ink is wiped off the high areas of the object. A sufficient pressure must be applied in order to force the paper or cloth or other substance against the object so that it pulls the ink out of the grooves. A basic step in the origins of printmaking is the conception that an object with lines incised or in relief can be inked and printed. Next is the realization that the most important features of this process is that it yields duplicates, that the number of impressions which are taken from the object is limited only by how many times it can be printed before wearing out. The engraved object is not conceived then as of first importance. It is the originals in duplicate which becomes the primary end. The possibilities for printmaking existed from earliest civilization. No doubt impressions were taken from engraved objects many times during the centuries which preceded the beginnings of printmaking. The perishable nature of the substances used has prevented the survival of such primeval incunabula. I hope I pronounce incunabula. It is not until the production of paper in large quantities that the history of prints really begins. In the West, this is not until the 15th century. The earliest surviving prints are woodcuts, not engravings. Many of the cuts were actually metal, but the terms woodcut and engraving are used to distinguish between the relief and intaglio methods. It is simpler to print a woodcut or any other object in high relief than an engraving. The process of cutting away the background and leaving the lines to be printed in relief is more closely a reproductive method than engraving. As the invention of the roller press, which provides sufficient pressure to draw ink from the engraved plates, engraving became common as a means of printmaking. However, one of the requirements of such a press is that the engraved object is to be printed from must be quite flat. Such a limitation makes it very difficult to use irregularly shaped objects, such as part of a gun. There are two ways to print from an engraved object. Either it can be inked and the incised lines are printed from, or it can be inked so that the portion in relief bears the ink. In the second case, there is a reversal in which all the engraved lines are white and all the surfaces are black. The result is a print looking very much like a photographic negative. Since it is impossible to put the engraved part of the gun through a roller press, it is much easier to print by the second method. Most gun pulls and impressions taken from armor are printed this way, which accounts for the effect so similar to rubbings, which also record only the relief areas of the surface. Most of Nimschke's pulls are printed in this manner, though naturally there are some cases in which ink has been lifted from incised lines. There is no question that Nimschke's engravings were intended primarily for decoration on the surface of the gun. At times, engravings have been made to serve two purposes equally. As an example, the engraved lines done often on a precious metal, frequently silver or gold, from which a few impressions were taken, but not enough to damage the plate. The engraved object was often a commemorative medal. In the 17th century, it was a frequent custom to give such a medal at weddings and in christenings. This type of engraving can only be distinguished from others when there is an elaborate inscription which has not been reversed on the medal, so reads backwards on the impression. Only in the case of long inscriptions can we make this distinction, for artists are often notoriously lax about making the first reversal. Nimschke's workbook was made to provide a record of his work. Doubtless, he kept it both to keep from repeating himself too closely and to provide himself with designs for the great quantity of guns he engraved. Probably there were only single impressions taken from the guns, and the book was kept together by him. However, there was no reason for him not to have taken several impressions and to have circulated them to other engravers. Certainly, other gun and armor makers did this in the past. One must differentiate Nimschke's record book from the prints and pattern books, which in as early as the 16th century were made to supply the engraver with ornament. Both Hayward and S.V. Gransva have commented on the importance of such prints. What mainly distinguishes them is that they are printed from engravings made for the purpose of printing from, not from the gun or pieces of armor. The pattern books were designed sometimes by gun makers and often by designers much more interested in the ornament than the use of the object. Nimschke's work provides a particularly interesting record of the way in which a very good gun engraver worked. Important in itself, it is additionally of interest because of what it reveals about the reason why certain prints were made and what their function was once they had been made. Like most gun engravers, Nimschke's borrowings are more numerous than his inventions. His workbook, in addition to containing his own pulls, includes many of his sources. Hayward has stated that the ornament on firearms has for the most part been drawn from printed pattern books. Nimschke did not restrict himself to pattern books. Larry Wilson has perceptively identified many of his other sources. The publication of Nimschke's record book is important because by examining the way one man worked, in this case a gun engraver, we can come to a clearer understanding of the function of prints. John J. McKendry, Assistant Curator of Prints, Metropolitan Museum of Art, New York. Okay, I don't know if I should read the foreword at this point. That's probably enough reading for now. But, table of contents, where are we going here? Well, here's a picture of the pattern book as it existed, and pages from some of the books prior to his, so on. And here we start to see some photographs of his work, a number of different variations of firearms, classic Nimschke scroll here on a Remington rolling block, classic scroll. Just here's some smaller, much smaller, more of a Germanic type scroll. Back to the classic Nimschke work. And I'd say this about Nimschke. Kurt Horvath, a well-known American engraver that trained in Belgium. He trained with René Delcourt, who taught at the Leon Mignon School there in Belgium. Kurt says that René said that you could make a living cutting nothing but Nimschke work. It's clean, fast, super looking scroll, and a lot of clients want it, and it's easy to cut, and it's classic. So there's one man from across the ocean's view on an American Engraver. Here's a nice interesting page of the various distant ornaments that Nimschke used and the names. Checkerboard, cross-hatching, arrow, star, we can pretty well get those. This particular wheat chaff, most of us are more familiar with a wheat chaff that comes from Linton McKenzie's work. So here's a different wheat chaff that Nimschke used. Here's 3 different guns with classic Nimschke work on them. It just doesn't get much better than this. Anyway, these are photographs of the actual guns and even some of his lettering to give you an idea of what we're fixing to see in these pulls. And some of these, you can see the actual pulls that were made from these guns. So this was the opening page on Nimschke's book, 1850. And apparently the ink even bled through from one side to the other as he was making his notes on what was there. And portraits, you know. There's a lot of great portraits in this book. You know, it's maybe not as fine as what we think of as Italian Bellino dot work or even banknote engraving, but it actually, I'd say it puts up with any banknote engraving. It's the human portraits he does are very well done. And of course, a lot of these are in the negative because they're pulled just like the smoke print that I made. They show a negative, but some of them he's actually reversed them, put tape to tape, and created the piece in a positive as you flip through here. Just lots of things. See, this is here's two different. This is a very simple line cut pattern. And then here's more advanced with lots of shading and little crosshatch lines put into it. Whatever the customer could afford to pay for, that's what he was putting out. Here's an interesting pattern, kind of Moorish or Arab looking. Kind of makes me think of Otto Carter, who just did some Arabic work. But most of this stuff is what we call a classic Nimschke scroll through here. But there are classic differences. The dog's head or other animals. Sometimes there's eagles or sometimes there's deer that come out of the end of the scrolls. Very common in Nimschke work. And multiple guns. And of course, here you can see the relative size because these are prints from the real thing, you know. So these are much smaller objects and much smaller scrolls in comparison to these. These scrolls are huge in relation to these. And if we go on, we'll find here's some smaller scrolls. Here's smaller examples. But this is a smaller example, but this is still classic Nimschke, just done in a smaller style. Whereas, well, like here's an earlier style that's not really Nimschke, and yeah, I wouldn't really call that Nimschke either. That's more of an American scroll. We got here. Oh, there's my OGCA Ohio Gun Collectors badge. I should put that somewhere important. Some monograms, various other ornamentations on the barrels. I guess this is an octagonal barrel gun with all the flats done here. Hunting scenes. More human portraits. Here's some fine, almost English style scrolls on the hammers here. A lot of lettering here. Very fine scrolls in here, English style patterns. Again, there's a wide variety of patterns in here. Game scenes of all sorts, dog portraits. It's just a fantastic reference. Bunch more portraits we got here, and scenes, game scenes. There's a stagecoach. There's some Arabic characters. Lots of classic Nimschke work here. Other scroll styles here. Big, bold styles that aren't this isn't really Nimschke. This is more of a geometric version. This maybe sort of blends into a Moorish style. Very cool. This is a very interesting, highly shaded scroll work here. In fact, I think I copied that on a few scrolls back in the 80s sometimes. Oop, well, my smoke print wants to be in the book too, I guess. The wind just blew it down. Anyway, there's lots in this book to see. I highly recommend you add it to your library. You can spend hours in here. And, well, I'll tell you what I did when I first got this. I actually first encountered this book at the J.M. Davis Gun Museum out in Oklahoma. It's kind of out in the middle of nowhere, but they've got like 5,000 guns in this museum. Wonderful place to visit. And they had this book, and then I spent the morning looking at all the guns there, and then I spent the afternoon with some tracing paper that I went and bought at a local 5 and dime, and they had a shelf of gun books, and this was on it, and I spent the afternoon tracing out Nimschke patterns. Here's another very different style pattern here. And I highly recommend any aspiring engraver. I see so many people wasting so much time trying to draw scrolls where they've read in different books. Many are excellent teachers about how to draw scrolls. And to me, they'd be far better off to spend their time, instead of trying to draw a scroll and pasting it up on the Facebook and asking for critiques from people, many of whom don't even know what they're looking at. Get you some tracing paper and just trace all these wonderful patterns. You'll see how the scrolls flow, how they're supposed to come out of each other, how they stay concentric, how the leaves equally are formed as they go around the scroll, how you can pull animals out of the scroll where they look nice. Trace, people. Get some tracing people and a pencil and just trace. When you've traced this for 40, 50, 60, 80, 200 hours, then you try to draw some scrolls, and you'll start drawing scrolls much smoother, much nicer, much more correctly, flowing correctly, than trying to just jump right into it. Here's some very big pieces. A lot of prize guns. You know, a lot of these prize guns, they had long range, Ballard, mid-range, a lot of shooting competitions back then. This is just a fantastic book. You really should have it in your library. What more can I say? Here's more smaller various scrolls. And of course the book's well documented about what's there. And get you a copy. I hope you've enjoyed this episode of the Engravers Library. These two great books, Roger Bleile's American Engravers from 1980 and R.L. Wilson's L.D. Nimschke Firearms Engraver from 1965. Let's put them back up on the shelf. Please subscribe to my YouTube channel, Quality Has No Regrets. We'll be discussing engraving and other classic gun issues, and then some other very interesting collections of fine handwork that I have. And you can check me out on learntoengrave.com. And here's one of my new business cards, hot off the press. Very cool, clear card. These are printed by a company up in Minnesota called Plastic Printers, plasticprinters.com. And come to my engraving that I host in June every year. Look for information on it on the web. Thank you.